In 1751, an American-born carpenter named Robert Harper received a patent of land for 125 acres from the English at the Hole, where the Potomac and Shenandoah rivers meet. The great waterways allowed for an abundance of transportation and settlement, making this location a perfect starting point for European and American settlers moving into the beautiful Shenandoah Valley and westward. It was here at the confluence of these two mighty rivers that Robert Harper built his ferry crossing, charging settlers a small fee to safely cross over the river. Within 12 years, in 1763, Virginia's Federal Assembly voted to establish the town of Shenandoah Falls, Virginia, near Harper's Ferry crossing. Thomas Jefferson, who visited the location in 1783, called the site perhaps one of the most stupendous scenes in all of nature. The popularity of the location soon grew, and by 1794, George Washington, who had visited the site and had family that lived nearby, selected Shenandoah Falls, or Harper's Ferry, to be one of the best locations to build one of two federal arsenals, where the river power and transportation would allow for the metal works to produce guns, ammunition, and artillery pieces for the U.S. government, the other location being in Springfield, Massachusetts. In 1796, Washington purchased land from the Harper family, and by 1799 the construction began for the Federal Armory and Arsenal at Harper's Ferry. A booming industrial town, by 1833, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal linked Harper's Ferry to Washington, D.C., a distance of only about 60 miles. And by 1844, the Baltimore and Ohio Railway came into the town. John Brown, born in Connecticut, moved his family westward to Kansas. He was a small business laborer and an abolitionist who believed in a radical way to force human rights. He believed that the only way to stop slavery permanently was by violent, armed insurrection. On the eve of the Civil War in 1859, John Brown decided he'd use the strength of the abolitionist movement to create a slave revolt that would invade upon Southern slave owners his personal wrath and loathing, using escaped slaves as his soldiers. But to do this, he needed guns, cannons, artillery, ammunition, and slave soldiers. To get all these things, he must first travel to a Southern federal arsenal, take it, stir up the slaves in the surrounding area, and march southward along the Appalachian Trail all the way to Alabama. John Brown made his way across the country from Kansas to Maryland, where he and his family rented a small farmhouse near Harper's Ferry under the alias of Isaac Smith. With him, he brought 21 men, including his 3 sons, 3 free slaves, 1 freed slave, and 1 fugitive slave. He also brought with him his wife and young daughters. From this location, he made his plans to raid the Federal Armory and Arsenal at Harper's Ferry. On the eve of October 16, 1859, John Brown and his men left the rented farmhouse in Washington County, Maryland, and made their way to Harper's Ferry, just 5 miles distance. But on the way, they stopped to capture Colonel Lewis Washington, a great-grandnephew of George Washington, release his slaves, and take 2 relics that once belonged to George Washington. One was Washington's battle sword, and the other a set of pistols, both considered by John Brown to be good luck, as it got George Washington through his battles. Once this was achieved, they moved on to Harper's Ferry, capturing watchmen and townspeople. They cut telegraph wires, seized the Baltimore and Ohio train that passed through, and took the life of Hayward Shepherd, who was a baggage handler for the train, who dared confront the raiders in his defiance. Shepherd, ironically, was a freed black man and the first victim of the raiders. John Brown, in remorse for Shepherd's death, released the train, but the conductor, all the way back to Washington, D.C., alerted every authority along the path. John Brown was surprised when local slaves did not join him and his raiders, but joined the local townspeople to protect them and their homes and family. Early morning on October 17, 1859, Brown discovered that locals were surrounding the arsenal and armory, protecting it from Brown's raiders, while others surrounded Brown and his raiders and captives at John Brown's Fort, located just across the street from the arsenal and armory. John Brown's Fort was a small brick fire engine house and guard room. Knowing his raid had failed, Brown sent out 2 of his men with a white flag of truce, but one was shot dead immediately. The locals was accepting no truce, and President James Buchanan ordered the U.S. Marines to march on Harper's Ferry under the command of then U.S. Brigadier Colonel Robert E. Lee. On the morning of October 18, 1859, Colonel Lee sent U.S. Lieutenant Jeb Stuart under a flag of truce to negotiate a surrender with John Brown and his followers. But this time, Brown refused surrender, so Lee moved his Marines against the raiders. According to Lee, he believed John Brown to be insane, the plan being that of a fanatical madman, he said. He also stated that the few African Americans that were involved were used by force and gave no volunteer service to John Brown. John Brown was wounded and captured by the Marines and taken to nearby Charlestown Courthouse for trial, where he was found guilty of treason and hanged on December 2, 1859. The execution was witnessed by many on that day, including John Wilkes Booth, who would later assassinate President Abraham Lincoln. It is believed by many that this violent act of rebellion and the attempt to incite slaves to revolt throughout the South started the first rumblings of the Civil War. A note was handed to a guard by John Brown just before his hanging, containing John Brown's last thoughts on the matter of civil insurrection. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land can never be purged but with blood.